Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, welcome all to History of College Textbook Prices, examining past practices and emerging models. My name is Trudy Radke, and I am the project manager for inclusiveaccess.org, and I'm going to be your guide today for this brief history tour. Just one housekeeping thing before we get started. I do live right across the street from an elementary school, and I think they're going to be out to play tag in about 10 minutes. So if there's any background noise, I do apologize for that, but at least it'll be happy voices. All right, let's get started. All right, so a brief outline to contextualize our journey today. First, we're going to discuss how high textbook costs have negatively impacted students. So we're just going to do some context setting. Then we're actually going to dig into the history of this. So first, how did this start? A brief history of high textbook costs. Then we're going to move into how things change, the impact of new policies and market forces. And then we're going to briefly discuss where we are now, the shift to digital first and inclusive access programs. So first and foremost, that context setting. High textbook costs negatively impact students. I feel like if you are in the textbook affordability movement in any capacity, this is something you are quite familiar with. So as of December 2021, the price of college textbook has risen 150% since January 2000. And you can see here that it's aggressively outpaced inflation, outpaced only by hospital services and college tuition and fees. So a report from US Per, about 65% of students surveyed reported skipping buying a textbook because of the cost, despite 90% being significantly or somewhat concerned that not purchasing these materials would negatively impact their grades. The proportion of students who skipped buying a textbook because of cost increased to 86% for students who reported experiencing food insecurity during the pandemic. So even though this textbook crisis has been in the national conversation for about 15 years now, coming up on 20 years, it's still a very present issue. And it's not just, of course, students that are concerned about this, although they are the demographic most directly affected. 81% of faculty overall agree that the cost of textbooks is a serious problem for students. And this is a Bayview Analytics report from 2020. So not a new issue, but certainly still a current one. All right, how did we get here? So I'm going to break this down a little bit more even so that we can kind of keep track of where we're headed. So first, we're going to talk about students as a captive market. We're going to define some economic terms and explain how that plays in the textbook industry marketplace. We're going to discuss publisher practices, and then we're going to move to advocacy efforts and see how higher education leaders and decision makers and movers and shakers have kind of responded to this crisis and what they've done about it. Okay, students as a captive market. So this student and consumer are required to purchase materials that they've been assigned regardless of the cost. So even though they're bearing the cost burden, they aren't the one making the choices about the product that will be utilized. This is also combined with the principal agent problem. So professors, in this case, the agent, they're in charge of selecting the materials, though students will ultimately bear the cost burden. There's also some historical issues with price awareness. So historically, professors could not always easily access price information on textbooks. All right, historical pricing practices. So publisher revenues from the beginning of this industry as a whole and grabbing this market have been derived from the new material market, or the first time a textbook is sold. The secondary market tends to diminish sales over time. So that secondary market really refers to the used book market. And used book market had existed for a while in the 80s, 70s even, and those local markets had disrupted the market a little bit for publishers, but it wasn't until the rise of the digital marketplace and how that became very efficient that they really started to see a cut in their profit margins. And we're going to dig into that a little bit more in the future. So over time, as rising prices drove more students to buy cheaper used books, publishers would just raise prices to offset lost sales. So this is called like the magic lever in this industry. And I have a quote later that I'm going to share with you guys that goes into more detail. This harmful cycle was exacerbated by a series of mergers and buyouts in the 80s and 90s that consolidated the market into three main companies. So that would be McGraw, Cengage, and Pearson. And even currently, those three companies corner about 80% of the textbook market. All right, this is that quote I was talking about. So this is from Michael Hansen, who's the current CEO of Cengage. The volumes of textbook publishers were selling declined rapidly for years. However, they always have had this magical price lever. They could always just increase the price so their revenue looked relatively stable. So there is an acknowledgement of this practice from the textbook industry itself as being a way to offset loss in profit margin. They're just going to raise the price of textbook in order to not be hit hard by that secondary market. And this is a quote from Wired, an interview with Wired in 2019. Okay, so these practices had existed for a long time. We mentioned their use in the 80s and 90s. But 2004 was a really big year for the textbook affordability movement. And the reason that was a big year is because it was the year that the crisis, as kind of a term, as a concept, first emerged into public discourse when student activists, and I have to give a shout out to US PIRG here, they did a lot of the research and reporting on this, raised awareness that the rapidly increasing cost of textbooks was the result of a broken market. So what do they specifically mean by a broken market? So primarily they meant limiting the used textbook market or that secondary market. So they documented that publishers engage in a variety of practices to increase new sales that limit this ability to buy cheaper used books. And some of these, if you've been in this conversation, you're probably familiar with them. Primarily, it includes releasing new editions every 3 to 4 years, despite limited changes to the content to drive up these new sales. This also included bundling textbooks with supplemental items, and these usually like shrink wrap bundles, often loose leaf. So the situation here is that once a student opens that shrink wrap, it's very difficult to resell this bundled material either back to the bookstore or to like a digital marketplace. It's very hard to have any resale value for these items, therefore driving up the new market and driving down the secondary one. This is an old screenshot from back in the day of one of these bundles. So students are paying for the biology textbook. They're also getting a study guide, 2 current issues in biology, volume 6 and 4, as well as a study card. And bundled, this material comes out to about $230. All right, congressional intervention. So this is a pivotal policy moment in this discussion. So based a lot on the researching done by US PIRG, Congress ordered an investigation into the college textbook industry by the Government Accountability Office, or GAO. And I am going to make sure I get my correct stats here, so let me refer to my notes. Okay, so they reviewed the 2003-2004 academic year, and this 2005 report that they released concluded that students at public 4-year institutions spent about 26% of the amount they spent on tuition and fees on textbooks. And students at public 2-year institutions spent 72% of what they spent on tuition and fees on textbooks. So this report was extremely eye-opening for textbook affordability advocates. Federal legislation introduced to require textbook price transparency and limit the practice of bundling passed in 2008, and it took effect in 2010. Once again, largely as a result of PIRG reporting on this issue. There was a 2013 follow-up from the GAO, and they found that price transparency increased quite a bit, but prices still remained high for many, many students. I also want to take a moment to note the timeline here. So my professional or academic background is actually in history. And I was very excited to do this presentation because I was able to dig into the historical context of this conversation a little bit. And I know that dates are one of the boring things about history, but I do think it's important here to take a moment to acknowledge the timeline. So this report was released in 2005. This federal legislation, USC 1015B, was passed in 2008, and it took effect in 2010. So we're really starting to see a disruption in the market happen around the early 2010s is when we really start to see major shifts as a result of textbook affordability advocacy and reporting, as well as this congressional investigation and then legislation. So keep those kinds of dates in your head, just the early 2010s. It's going to be crucial later on. So how did early advocates respond to this crisis? Policymakers, student groups, institutional leaders, and faculty from across the country really rallied to advance efforts to reduce the cost of course materials. Initiatives that they came up with range from textbook rental programs, guaranteed used book buybacks, which I took distinct advantage of when I was in college. Library run reserves also took advantage of that helped students get temporary access to their books. And then, of course, OER. Some faculty sought out lower cost or free options, such as OER and also those library reserves, while many libraries are launching or have launched programs to help curate these materials in an effort to drive down the cost of new textbooks and offer students courses where the course materials were free. As of 2014, based on this advocacy, more than 50% of all states have now passed legislation regarding or relating to textbook affordability. So this really is a national conversation. And even though textbooks and course materials are only an aspect, they're only an aspect of the conversation about college affordability as a whole in this country, there has been significant advocacy and investigation to this issue. All right, how did things change? So how did the textbook industry respond to disruption in the market? How had advocates come alongside and also responded in turn? What's been the hockey game here, so to speak? Policy changes and advocacy efforts prompt changes in the marketplace. Let's dig into those a little bit more. So first, how did this benefit students? How did this advocacy work for students? Growth in student options. So despite that magic lever of price increases, the digital marketplace enabled students to be more savvy consumers. They could actually shop around for the best deal. And because of the rise of things like Amazon and Chegg, they had easy access, where primarily it had only been local markets. They now could buy used books from across the country. Online and campus bookstores developed increasingly efficient used books and rental lists. I've mentioned that already, that helped these students save money. And price comparison tools, which I utilized a lot in college. Library reserves and on-campus book swaps helped even more. So there really was a local effort around this conversation, really at the campus level, to address this textbook affordability crisis. There has been a downward trend in student spending on textbooks for a variety of reasons, a lot based on this advocacy and also changing publisher textbook industry practices. But overall, it's fairly optimistic. You can see here the trend down to early 2010s, a slight uptick in 2020, and I'm going to talk about that more a little bit later, as well as a publisher study that was just released on this downward pricing trend. So we'll dig into that more later, but encouraging to know it has overall gone down. All right, disruption in the market. So the burgeoning movement for open educational resources, which is those free materials, they were introduced into the market. Organizations like and other efforts introduced competition in high enrollment courses. So really hitting those gen eds hard and offering like the history 101, physics 101, et cetera, driving more price competition than ever before. There was actually a Cengage report in 2018 that noted, for one of the first times that they actually noted that price competition was a consideration in how they were modeling their textbook programs. So this advocacy really did change the publisher response. They really did have to consider price competition a little bit more in their business metrics. Some publishers even launched products to capitalize on OER by selling platform access. So they had free or OER materials on their own digital spaces, and they would charge for that access, but they brought themselves into the OER conversation. So I showed this graph already, but I think that squiggle does a pretty good job of providing a quick snapshot of this disruption in the market. So it has aggressively outpaced inflation. It has risen pretty steadily for most of the time period we're talking about. But you'll notice where college tuition and fees and hospital service pretty much just continue on an upward trend, there really is that disruption as evidenced in this graph, the squiggle line, so to speak. Okay, so how did the publishing industry respond to this? How did the textbook industry seek to make up for that loss in revenue? Well, the answer really is just like their consumers shift to this digital market, the textbook industry has also recognized the value of shifting to this digital marketplace. And they're doing that in a variety of ways, which I'm going to dig into a little bit more. But this is also happening quickly. So I mentioned earlier the timeline, the dates here are important. So advocacy started in the mid 2000s, legislation and advocacy was really going hard by like the early 2010s. And that's when publishers really started to reevaluate their model. That's when we saw a shift to digital materials starting around the early to mid 2010s and increasing as the decade went on. And now in 2022, we're going to discuss where they find themselves in this digital marketplace. So first, it's important to note that digital revenue has only begun to outpace print materials in the last few years, primarily attributable to the increased sale of digital courseware bundled with textbooks. So there's two components to this move to the digital space for the industry. So first, we're going to talk about courseware. Courseware is also known as access codes, and this is where students purchase a single-use code that expires at the end of the course. So this access code may be their e-textbook, but more often than not, we find that it's a homework software platform that students must purchase in order to complete part of their grade. And as far as the textbook industry is concerned, this is actually a clever way to kind of re-corner that market a little bit. If a student has to purchase an access code for a specific software platform, and their homework credit is only going to be counted if they turn in their assignment through this platform, there's basically no alternative to an access code, especially if the professor that is assigning it has gone with a specific company. You can't go buy Cengage's access code for cheaper if it's a Pearson textbook. You need to buy Pearson's access code. So this is how the first way in which these companies re-corner the market, and it's been fairly successful. It's also helped them shift into the digital marketplace. A 2016 report from Student Pergs noted that 80% of students have been assigned an access code at least once in a course. I remember these in college. I feel like they mostly are represented in the STEM fields. I know biology majors use these quite a bit, physics, but they're really everywhere. I remember using them in Spanish, lots of language courses actually. So it's really a cross-discipline shift. Okay, where are we now? So the industry's moved to digital first strategy driven by inclusive access programs. So I mentioned this industry shift to digital. So the first way that they kind of entered in that, they came up with the bundles, and now they're moving to access codes and courseware, which has been around for a while and have been fairly successful in re-cornering that market. Another strategy is this inclusive access program approach. So first, I'm going to share with you a quote from the former CEO of Pearson, John Fallon. Then we're going to parse that out a little more clearly. So this is a quote from a 2019 Vox interview in which the former CEO states that Chegg and Amazon moved into the rental market. So essentially what we found is actually our biggest competitor was secondhand sales of our own intellectual property. So once again, this acknowledgement of the secondary market is really cutting into profit margins and kind of the traditional way textbooks were disseminated. Once you get your head around that, you just accept that actually the $300 textbook is dead. So there is acknowledgement, there's industry acknowledgement that the way that it's been done for the past 30 or so odd years, even more, is not going to be successful in the future. They're realizing that they need to change their business model somewhat in order to try to combat the secondary market, but also just keep up with this shift to digital that does seem to be taking place at higher ed, even spurred on by the pandemic, as we're all aware. So we've talked about courseware, we've talked about access codes. Now we're going to talk about inclusive access. So a courseware or an access code, that's a specific product from that publisher that you need to do, usually to turn in your homework. Sometimes it's a textbook, and it's specific to that publisher. So they've figured out how to corner the market in terms of actually just offering resources that must be accessed digitally, but also just our digital resources. Inclusive access is more of a dissemination approach. So it's moving what used to be print materials into a digital space. It's a digital first model and distributing these materials purely in the digital format, usually through the learning management system, as colleges across the country and the world make this shift more to online learning. So my background is in online education, ed technology, and instructional design. And something that I always think of when I think of how to like contextualize this shift is how there used to be a phrase, at least in my experience in California community college system, of web enhanced, a course being web enhanced. And that usually meant that the LMS system, so their Blackboard, Moodle, Canvas, was utilized by the faculty member to disseminate course content, even though it wasn't necessarily an online course, it was still a face-to-face course. So that's a web enhanced course. I think post-pandemic, what we're starting to see, and we had been before, but really post-pandemic, my apologies, as we continue through this pandemic, what we're seeing is this idea of web enhanced is kind of falling away because more and more courseware is disseminated online, even in a face-to-face course. Not all of it, there's still lecturing, there's still a lot of this traditional approach, but more and more of the content is being disseminated online. So we've gotten to the point where web enhanced, although the terminology is not gone yet, it's falling a bit to the wayside because it's difficult at this point, for the most part, to find a class that is intrinsically web enhanced up to some point, especially in terms of course content dissemination. And the textbook industry recognizes this as well. And that is kind of their pitch for inclusive access. So first, let's all get on the same page. Some of us may be familiar with these programs, some of us maybe not. Let's define it. Inclusive access is a textbook sales model that adds the cost of digital course content into student tuition and fees. All right, how does inclusive access work? 4 points here. First, programs usually start with an agreement between an institution, a bookstore, and a publisher. Usually the bookstore acts as a third party to disseminate that content. Second, digital content is delivered to students at the start of the course, typically through a learning management system. Third, students have a period to opt out before they are automatically billed for the cost of their course materials. Some models of these are opt-in, tend to be opt-out. And finally, after the course ends, students often lose access to the content. So this really is not only just a digital first model, but a digital first rental model, though not entirely. There are some programs that are offering perpetual access. However, even these programs offering perpetual access, usually it's DRM resources. So it's all rights reserved still, and they are giving the student a of the material that can only be downloaded on one computer. So it's not a transferable download. They can't take it off that computer or they'll lose access to it. But it is important to note that some of these programs are starting to offer perpetual access, but it is a pretty highly regulated perpetual access. All right, how do these programs vary? So most campuses deploy it course by course, but there are some campuses where it is program or campus-wide. We are seeing a shift to more of these campus-wide programs. So inclusive access, I mentioned the timeline earlier, started to pop up in the mid-2010s. That's when these programs started launching. They didn't really gain traction until the late 2010s. And now in this pandemic era, we've noticed since there's been this huge shift to digital, they're becoming increasingly popular. So as their popularity grows, this campus-wide subscription to these programs is increasing, whereas before it was just program by program. Two, students typically get billed the cost of their specific materials, and that is more common where it's like course by course. But sometimes they're billed a flat fee, or occasionally it is included in tuition. And finally, access is often limited, once again, to expiring digital materials, but occasionally there are longer term access, such as some of these offering perpetual access or print rental options. An important note to make, generally, if a student wants a print version of what they're offering through this inclusive access digital first model, they do need to pay an additional fee on top of what they're already paying to access the inclusive access program for this print version. So it truly is a digital first model. All right, now I'm going to dig a little bit more into the actual models. These are not what they're called officially. This is kind of internal terminology. So the first is a la carte. And that's what I mentioned. Students are charged the cost of the specific materials they have been assigned. I didn't include them in this presentation, but I've got a couple of screenshots. So Drury University offers their students a chemistry textbook for about $120. They use the a la carte model. So prior to the start of that course, or just prior to the start of that course, students, if they choose not to opt out, will be automatically billed $120 for that material, and they will be able to access that chemistry textbook day one of their course through their learning management system. The second is the flat fee. Students are charged a flat amount based on how many units or credit hours they're taking, And this is important no matter what their specific materials cost or if they are free. So this is not kind of like humanities gets a certain price and STEM gets a certain price, or if somebody's utilizing an OER book or an OER resource, the price goes down. It's just an average price across the board. Usually these credit fees range from, we've seen most commonly like $20 to $30. 25 seems to be popular. So if a student was taking 15 units, that would be $25 per unit, comes out to around $350, $75 for the semester. I did say it was history, not math. So that comes out to about $375 for course materials for the semester that they are automatically billed. Okay, so we at inclusiveaccess.org, we have dug into these inclusive access models. We're interested in this trend. We are interested to see how the publishers utilize this to, our publishing industry, textbook industry, utilizes this to recorner the market a little bit, and what their strategy is for going about that. So we have a couple of points that we like to discuss based on the textbook industry's claims of inclusive access programs. And the first point we like to make is savings or spin. So inclusive access, a big claim to fame for these programs is that they do claim to lower the cost of materials. So they say inclusive access because it's digital first, because it's digital content, it's a rental usually, it's cheaper. So it is discounted. Our question is, how much is it discounted? So it's important to note that when they say that the textbook is discounted, what they mean is it's cheaper than the sticker price of a brand new textbook on that publisher's website. So it's not an aggregate average of, used books, rental books, and new books. It's just cheaper generally than that brand new book from the publisher's website. That is what they're using to determine that price metric. And I've already discussed this before. I've shown some graphs similar to this. We know that college textbooks have outpaced inflation. If it ends up being long-term a lot cheaper for students in inclusive access programs to access their materials, that's fabulous. That's wonderful. Our concern is we want to make sure that publishers are standing up to their own claims and that they continue to offer competitive pricing in inclusive access programs. So one, key on competitive there, we want to make sure that it is lower, like quite a bit lower than just that sticker price for a new book. We believe that the discounts should be significant, but more important, we don't want to see any magic price lever practices employed in inclusive access programs. So I've FOIA'd quite a few contracts, inclusive access contracts from across the country, looking at schools that have utilized this model and have signed contracts with these inclusive access vendors. And while they mention letting the campus know if they're going to increase that credit or hour rate, like that $25 per credit hour, they mention that they'll let the campus know, but there's no price cap. There's potential for that rate, that credit hour rate, to just kind of increase. And our concern is that they may increase that credit hour rate the same way that they have increased just the overall cost of textbooks in the past. So we don't have enough data on that, but when we're exploring corporations, it's important to look at past behavior to predict future trends. So no data on that yet. These are just some of the issues we're grappling as people that have been in the textbook affordability crisis movement for quite some time. The second point that these inclusive access programs make is that they provide that access, that first day access. So right when the student gets in the course, they have access to the materials the first day, which has been a big selling point for inclusive access programs. Getting everyone on board the same day is important to be successful in a course, not waiting on that course material to show up. Our question is, does that constrain students' choice as a consumer? So once again, shown graphs similar to this, trends in student spending on textbooks have gone down. So since the early 2010s, we've noticed a pretty nice downward shift in student spending on textbooks. You will notice there that there is a slight uptick just around the time of the pandemic. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The first is that it was just more difficult to get access to lower cost materials because of the pandemic, because of disruptions in the market. Second reason is that publishers slightly did increase prices. Once again, looking at past practices to predict future trends. Now, I do want to take a moment to note that the industry has released a study. It came out just last week. And I want to make sure that it was, yes, American Association of Publishers. They released a study about a week ago saying that overall, since the early 2010s, student spending on textbooks has overall gone down. They say it's gone down about 44%. That study, the press release is public, the study is behind a paywall. So we have not yet got the funds together to access that study. So I personally haven't had a chance to examine it, to dive into it. I'm eager to do so. I think if overall indeed student spending on textbooks has gone down that much, that is most certainly something to celebrate. Our questions are how much of that was HERF funding or CARES funding? And is it possible that that perhaps is a factor in driving those costs down during the pandemic, all of the money that was given to institutions to help with course materials? So we have questions, but eager to dive into those. Hopefully I'll be able to access that study soon and put that data into these slides. And like I said, hopefully it's gone down. We can always hope. Talked a lot about students and how students are impacted by this shift to digital course and these inclusive access programs. But what other populations, campus populations, have the potential to be affected? So something that we've looked a lot is and their right to choose the materials that best fit their students' needs. So who decides to implement an inclusive access program on a campus? By and large, it tends to be administrators. So I mentioned earlier, a lot of my background is in ed tech. On the surface, this actually makes a lot of sense because the way that technically it makes a lot of sense because the way that inclusive access programs are set up is as subscriptions. And campus-wide subscriptions tend to be under the purview of administration. It just makes logistical sense to do it. Because, however, inclusive access isn't ed tech, it is course materials. Our concern is that our faculty being brought into this conversation at the level at which they need to be in order to make course material decisions. I also want to take a moment to note, I've spoken and worked with many administrators in my career, and I can't even recall working with an administrator that was acting in bad faith. I think administrators, they understand the textbook affordability crisis at this point. They want to help. They hear students asking for better pricing, and inclusive access claims to offer those discounts. I think for a lot of administration, this is seen as a win. And I most certainly think that inclusive access programs can be deployed in such a way that is really beneficial for students. So I think administrators are making choices in good faith about inclusive access programs. We just feel that faculty are really necessary as part of this conversation as the content experts. All right, one of our final points here, deal or data mine. So another potential point of interest with inclusive access programs is the way that they utilize reading analytics. So once again, the textbook industry is they understand that digital is where it's at. They understand that courseware, ancillary materials, making this content digital is a new way to corner or re-corner this market. And one of another selling point for the digital first model is reading analytics. So reading analytics is tracking how often a student opens their textbook, how long they stay on a page, how many pages they actually read in one session. And the industry is actually marketing this as a valuable asset to institutions, saying you can have access to information on how students are actually interacting with your course content. You can dig into it and see what they're actually reading and what they're not. And this is a true claim. They are giving administration and faculty access to these reading analytic insights. Our question is, first, what are the security protocols in place to make sure that student data is protected? In 2022, we're no stranger to tech companies, even large reputable tech companies, being the victims of data breaches. That's just kind of par for the course at this point. Data security is really crucial. And second, we want to make sure that the student data isn't being used for any nefarious purposes or being sold to third parties for profit. So these are just some of the questions we have around the collection of student data. It's early on. We're going to need more time to determine how data is going to be used by the textbook industry and how it's gathered via these inclusive access programs. But one thing that we can discuss right now is what is the institution's responsibility in letting students know how their data is going to be collected via digital courseware or digital textbooks. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being a perfect understanding of how their data when they access a digital material, and 1 being a poor understanding most students score about a 2. And I would say that that keeps with my anecdotal observations of students moving through their academic careers. I mentioned I was in ed tech. A big part of my job was actually reading ed tech contracts before we signed with a particular vendor to make sure that student data was protected, that we were getting a high quality competitive product that would be in FERPA guidelines and would take good and safe care of our students' data. But in my day-to-day life, I'm constantly accessing applications that the terms and condition pops up and I don't read it because I don't always have time to read it. How much less so are students who are just trying to access their textbook going to read that entire terms and conditions and actually meaningfully understand and interpret what's happening to their data. So I think this is probably honestly a little bit of like the new frontier of higher ed advocacy. I think a lot of it's going to revolve around student data. So as institutions, what steps can we take to make sure that our students are well informed and informed upfront about their data collection and how it's being collected and why? And I don't know that we can always rely on the industry to do that. I think we need to be as transparent as possible in interpreting this for our students and putting this information somewhere they can actually meaningfully access it. So I'll leave you guys with just kind of this final point. Students cannot learn from materials they cannot afford. This point is important to me professionally. I've mentioned that, you know, my entire career is in higher ed. So I'm very about this from a professional standpoint, but also a personal one. I was a first generation college student from a lower socioeconomic background when I went to school. And I've told this story many times, and I apologize if there's any in the audience that have heard it before. But my first semester in college, when I went to buy my textbooks, they were $700. And I was shocked. Like, you could have knocked me down with a feather because it had never occurred to me. Like, I was so proud of myself. I took all these steps to get to school, to get to my local community college. And when I saw the sticker price for those textbooks, I was floored. I couldn't afford them. That also was a semester I needed new glasses, and I could barely swing that. So really, it came down to glasses or textbooks, and I chose glasses because that seemed a little bit more immediate. But yeah, this is also really important to me personally, and you know, we're grappling with, as we've just gone through, there's a large historical context for this conversation. There's lots of work that's been done. There's lots of work that needs to be done. But I think it's important to take the time to contextualize the story of textbook affordability in this country and really kind of give it that historical context as we move forward and continue to bargain for the best deals for our students. So as my grandmother would say, there you go and there you have it. I really moved through this quite quickly. If you'd like to learn more about inclusive access programs and get some resources that can help you understand inclusive access programs a little bit better, and also navigate inclusive access programs, and if your institution is considering has adopted an inclusive access program, how to make sure that your students are really getting the best possible experience that they can from the program. You can find all of those resources at inclusiveaccess.org. We also have a button right on our homepage. You can request a presentation from us. We'll come to your campus, talk to students, administrators, librarians, whoever you feel needs to know a little bit more about this. And you can also reach out to me there. My email's on the website, and I would love to hear from you. So I planned on leaving time for questions. I've left quite a bit of time for questions. I'll probably try to keep it to around 10 to 15 minutes. And then maybe hopefully I can give you guys 10 minutes of your day back. All right.
Hey, Trudy, didn't see any specific questions in the chat, but there was one comment about Cengage Unlimited and Pearson Plus as sort of flat fee access to an entire publisher's catalog, and that being a significant sort of step in this process. I'm wondering if you can add anything on that.
The model in general?
Yeah.
So as far as I'm aware of those programs, it is kind of like you pay a fee to access a publisher's entire kind of digital library, so to speak. That is an aspect of inclusive access. I know that it's been there's options where that's kind of a part of the program bundle. As far as I can tell, it is also, I believe it's a separate component. You can also just access the library separately. Is that kind of addressing the question, Nicole, that you saw?
Yeah. Yeah, and it was sort of a shift in the way that the publishers have sold textbooks in the past, that, you know, it's sort of individual materials and, you know, just thinking back to some of the material. So hi, I'm Nicole Allen, Director of Open Education for Spark. Some of the research that our organization has done on the publishing industry's business strategy has sort of reflected on how, you know, Cengage, it made sense in 2017 when they launched Cengage Unlimited as sort of a new concept for accessing textbooks. You know, of course, the price was really high. If you were assigned 4 Cengage textbooks, you know, maybe it's a good deal. But if only one, maybe not so much. And, you know, if you're being automatically charged for it, you know, maybe not at all. And then it was really interesting last year when Pearson launched Pearson Plus, which they made, you know, my perception of the announcement by Pearson is that they tried really hard to make it about an app, but it was really just the same thing as Cengage Unlimited, dressed up differently. It's interesting because Pearson is, you know, by conventional measures, the market leader, and it's actually rare to see a market leader follow sort of a trendsetter, I guess, or smaller player in the market like Cengage with a major step like that. So that was a really interesting announcement. To my knowledge, McGraw-Hill, there was a comment in the chat. I do not believe McGraw-Hill has launched a competing product yet, but if anybody has information on that, we'd be really interested to know. But it really does signal sort of a shift in the publishing industry's business strategy and thinking about this like one size fits all, university as the customer as opposed to the individual student type billing model.
Thank you, Nicole, for providing that context. And I did notice that there's a couple of questions here in the chat. Robert, your question about publishers raising prices of materials across the board. Do you think this may be an attempt, overt or not, to push people to digital inclusive access and access codes? Possibly. Like I don't want to stand here and speak for the publishing, you know, the textbook industry. It's not my field. I think my answer to that would be what it usually is, which is looking at past corporate practices to predict future trends. So maybe a bit of a sidestep there, but it's a worthwhile question to ask because, you know, there have been practices in the past that maybe could insinuate that, but I don't feel comfortable kind of calling it one way or the other. And then James in the chat here, question about nomenclature. What's the reasoning behind using inclusive access? Good question. Publishers sometimes say first day access or equitable access. Could we say forced purchase or something more realistic? There was a lot of conversation about this. It really is a good question. Ultimately, we went with the phrase inclusive access because it was kind of the primary one that publishers had latched onto early when they were first initially pushing these programs. There was discussion about maybe using automatic textbook billing or something that we felt was a little more literal, like a literal translation. The issue is that publishers were quite good at kind of harnessing this phrase and pushing it. And we came to the point where we didn't want to be fighting publishers on definitions. We wanted to use a phrase that consumers, institutions, to a point students would be familiar with so that we'd all be talking about the same thing. Now, so that's the reality. In my fantasy world, yeah, forced purchase all the way, like personally, but not all the way. That's not quite fair. But like we decided inclusive access is perhaps the best way to go about engaging with publishers on this topic. Zach, you mentioned what's been the response to publishers regarding inclusiveaccess.org. I haven't noticed, like I haven't personally interacted with any direct acknowledgement. I think they're certainly aware of it just based on interactions I've had, but I have not seen anything that's like a direct reaction to inclusiveaccess.org. I know that there was a publisher press release a couple of years back when this launched, a year and a half back. but I haven't noticed a ton of chatter specifically surrounding inclusiveaccess.org. Just checking the chat.
There's a question from Elizabeth Nelson. Do you have thoughts on the impact of temporary digital access to course materials and lifelong learning?
I have very strong feelings about this, Elizabeth. Thank you so very much for kind of raising that question. And yes, I'm just reading the tail end of it now. Yes. Okay. So I think that that is a very important question to be asking, even though it's less technical and more messaging. So I've brought this up before, but I think that it sends a distinct messaging signal when digital rental materials are provided for students, in the sense that we're saying, here's your text, and now we're taking it away. So first, there's kind of maybe a messaging gap. And I'll refer once again to my previous experience as a first generation college student from a lower socioeconomic background. I remember for me, messaging was very important because I was constantly getting these subtextual messages as a college student who really didn't know how to navigate college. And I certainly feel that there is a message implied there when we take away access to learning materials. What does that tell our students about kind of knowledge as a whole, access to knowledge, who deserves it, who gets it, for how long? I absolutely think that students pick up on that kind of subtext. So first of all, there's a messaging issue, I think, and that really does impact students' learning. You know, this is what we are talking about when we discuss equity issues in school. How do we make students really belong? And not just say they belong, but like create structures in which they can actually succeed academically. So there's a messaging component. The second thing is, does it impact like their literal lifelong learning skills? I think so. And every student is different, but once again, drawing from my own experience and from the experience of my peers who are in a similar situation as me, I had a lot of STEM friends. They agreed to hang out with a history major, and they would use those calculus textbooks, you know, sometimes for 3, depending on whether or not they pass Calc 2, 4 semesters. They would use the same textbook. That's kind of how those calculus textbooks are designed. And they became very attached, at least in my experience, to that textbook because they really were using it. Like it became like a manual almost. So I think that's kind of a broad answer to your question. But yes, I think there's a messaging issue there. And I think there's a technical issue there with, yeah, just providing them with the materials they actually need to develop lifelong learning skills instead of having this kind of like cut off to knowledge that I think that a digital rental implies. Hmm. Yeah, Rachel, your point on not being able to afford to purchase access codes for math. Yeah, yeah, courseware being a part of this is it's a salient question because, or topic, because it really is, there's no competitive alternative, right? If they're buying a Pearson courseware, they need to turn it in via that platform. They can't shop around for a competitive price. They do need that very specific access code. And it is like, I don't mean this in like a punitive way. I mean it in a literal way. It is a way to lock students in to that platform, to that metric, to that way of purchasing and interacting with their course materials. Mm-hmm. Great discussion in the chat. That's honestly one of my favorite things about doing these is like sometimes the conversations that are generated in the chat, I'm I'm writing them down for future presentation. Hmm. Just making sure I didn't miss anything. From Kevin, is there a recommendation on how to address homework platform use? Um, I mean, how much time do you have, Kevin? Yeah, yes and no. Like it's a very large conversation, very thoughtful question. It's one I've spent a lot of time contemplating. Um, eh, on the one hand, I have worked with a lot of faculty in STEM who feel that A lot of their learning outcomes are addressed by these homework platforms. They feel that it's a good way to test their students. And I think some of them are. I think that there is, it's not to say that none of these programs are quality. It's such a good question. I wish I had more of a succinct answer for you, but I think since it is it is a locked in kind of use model, I always recommend looking for alternatives if it's possible. And ironically, I actually think that there is kind of a segue here in from, I know this is kind of a tangent, but the proctoring platforms. I think that there's going to be larger conversations in higher ed about assessment. And is assessment actually separate from like the core, like especially in online courses, the course experience and the activities and things that they're doing in the course and the experience they're having in that course. So I think my recommendation is just, what is the homework platform doing that we can't assess another way? Is it really the only way to assess this type of learning? Is it the most effective way? I think it's like part of those larger conversations. Is it the most effective way to assess? Are there better ways that are not, super high stakes in terms of creating, that could just as effectively assess students? I think the answer is yes, and also no, potentially. But it's a really good question, Kevin. Please, when you find the answer, email me immediately. I'm desperate to know. Oh, and yes, of course. And then my open math, of course. Thank you, Elizabeth, for mentioning that. There are alternatives. I just think it's to say that there is as many alternatives as the publishers are offering, not quite there yet. I'm hoping one day soon. Awesome. Great discussion in the chat. I will definitely be saving this. Well, I will hang out for just a minute or two more to make sure that there are no questions that I missed. And if you did put a question in the chat and I missed it, I do apologize. Feel free to copy paste it back in or unmute, and I will address that question to the best of my ability. But last but not least, I really just want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us today. I feel very privileged to work in this space, and I appreciate your guys' time very much. So thank you.